Next part is the cross-examination, which is going to be a back and forth, a 10-minute total event. If I can have both of you up front.
So I guess I get to ask you as many questions as I can for 5 minutes.
Go right ahead.
And you answer as briefly as possible, and I'll try to do the same thing so we can get as many of them in. So when did the Exodus happen?
I believe that it happened in 1446 BC, though some scholars think it happened in the 13th century, but in either case, it was a definite historical event.
What language was written on the tablets of stone on the Ten Commandments?
I believe it was written in Hebrew.
Hebrew?
Yes, sir.
In what year did that happen?
I believe it was 1446 BC.
1446 BC.
Yes, sir.
God wrote it with his finger on the tablets in Hebrew.
Yes, sir. Since I believe that miracles are possible, I believe that it is possible for things that don't fit into your worldview to happen.
Well, it has nothing to do with my worldview. Are you aware of the fact that there was no Hebrew language in 1446 BC, that the Hebrew language did not originate until the 10th century? There was no Hebrew alphabet until about the 10th century. Are you aware of that historical, archaeological fact?
That is simply false. That is not true.
Do you have any evidence that Hebrew language was being written and spoken before the 10th century BC?
I can get you some. I can't like pull up a chart or something, but there is evidence that the Hebrew language did exist at that time.
There was?
Yes, sir.
Well, everything I read said there was not. The Hebrew language was not a dialect, a Semitic dialect, until the 10th century BC. So there's no way. Of course, I'm supposed to ask you questions.
Yeah, that's right.
So where are the Ten Commandments? I mean, this is supposedly God's important. Moses went up to this mountain out in the Sinai Peninsula that was smoking and quaking and screaming, and people couldn't see him. And then he came down with the second set that he came down with. So where are they?
I got a copy on my computer here. I got a copy.
Where are the physical stones?
I don't know where the physical stones are.
You don't know?
No, I don't.
So is there any evidence to confirm that those stones were written in Hebrew?
Well, one thing I would say is that the book, the Pentateuch, is in the form of a suzerain vassal treaty, which is a treaty format that only existed around the time that Moses was supposed to have come out of Egypt. It did not exist several centuries later on the late date assumption. So actually, if you look at the treaty format, some scholars have said that if we didn't have somebody like Moses, we'd have to assume that there was a person like that to make the document look like it did.
Yeah, that seems historical. It seems like you would need people to make up lies even. I mean, you need human beings to do that. So
what I'm saying, though, is that sorry, go ahead. It looks like a 14th century document, though.
So who was the Pharaoh in the Exodus story?
I think it was Amenhotep III, but some people say it was Ramses II, but he was a historical pharaoh, yes.
So you're aware of the fact that the Israelite stories mention all these kings by name. By the way, Daniel didn't mention names. He just said Greece and Persia. He didn't mention names of the people, and he knew about Greece. But you're aware of the fact that the Israelites mentioned, here was this king by this name, here was this king by that name. Why didn't, for historical reasons, why didn't the writer of the Pentateuch mention the name of the Pharaoh of Egypt?
Because he just didn't write it down. I mean, why don't you mention many names of people in your books? I mean, that doesn't mean he's not a historical person because he didn't say this is the guy's name.
Tell me, why did the Israelites have to take this long roundabout way to get to the Sinai Peninsula when there was a shorter route to get there, instead of going all the way south to cross the Red Sea? Why?
Because there were Egyptian garrisons in the northern route, which is historically verifiable, so they actually couldn't have gone through without having had war, which is why also the Bible says that they went the southern route to avoid the war.
Really?
Yes,
God
sir.
wanted to avoid a war. The God of war, who equipped his warriors with military finesse, who invaded and conquered the Canaan in the Promised Land, these brave Israelite warriors who were chased by this Pharaoh, nameless Pharaoh, this God was not powerful enough to let them break through a few garrisons at the border?
It wasn't a matter of power, but if I was a bunch of slaves that it wasn't used to fighting, I would probably like to get some time before I had to fight Egyptian garrisons. And there were Egyptian garrisons there.
So you admit they took a roundabout way?
Yeah, of course they took a roundabout way.
To get across.
It took them 40 years. That's pretty roundabout.
Get across the sea. 40 years it took them to go 130 miles.
Well, they weren't traveling the whole time. They were stationed in various places for a long time. But I'm just saying, certainly they weren't aiming for speed.
Do you know how
it wasn't
many,
like Uber or something.
You know how many people there were that were traveling there?
The Bible says 603,000 men.
And 559.
And 559. Okay.
603,559.
Yes. On the assumption that the word thousand, I think that that is the actual number. There are some scholars who say that the word thousand is referring to bands, in which case you could have a smaller number. But in either case, it definitely happened. I think it's thousands. But even if you said it was just bands, it would still actually, because the word thousand can be translated that way, it would still actually be a historical event.
So the total number of people would have been 2 or 3 million people. With
On the
wives
assumption
and
of
children.
603,000, yes.
Plus all their livestock.
Yes, on the assumption
Plus
that
all
that
their
number's right.
tents that they had one day to put together, right? So they somehow in one day,
Time.
3 million people got across. You believe that is a historical fact?
Yes.
All right. Reset the clock. Mr. Ross, you have the floor.
Don't start until my computer turns on. I don't want to do that. There we go.
Pray for it.
Yeah.
It worked.
Turned on, yeah, there we go.
It's a miracle.
Right. Mr. Barker, I'm looking on page 640 of On the Reliability of the Old Testament by K.A. Kitchen. Are those pictures of camels? Is that a picture of a camel at Ur? Is that a picture of a camel at Byblos in the 2nd millennium? Is that a picture of a camel in the early 2nd millennium in Syria? Is that a picture of a camel in Egypt in the 13th century BC? Is that a picture of camel at By-Ramses on a plot in the 13th century BC?
Maybe, but let me answer your question. I did not say there were no camels before that time.
Oh, okay.
There were camels. There were camels millions of years ago. And there were camels in that part of the world,
Oh, okay.
even before that time.
Okay.
The question is, were there domesticated camels that were being used for caravans and beasts of burden? And you probably saw the article in Tel Aviv magazine.
Is that a pot on the camel that it's carrying?
I don't know what that is. That
Looks
looks
like a pot.
scribble to me, but whatever it
Okay,
is.
it says loaded camel figure, and there's a slot for the hump and the load for the camel to carry. That camel is from Ur, the Chaldees, which is where Abram is from. Those look like camels to me. So I don't know about
Those are
that camel thing.
drawings. Do you know the dates of those drawings? But in any
Yes,
event,
this is 19th, 18th century BC. This is early 2nd millennium. This one is early 2nd millennium. 13th century BC. This is actually where the Israelites were, Pi-Ramses, 13th century BC.
doesn't that look like it's a broken part and somebody just penciled in that little part in the middle? Doesn't that look like?
Okay, I'm done with that. If you want to say they're not
Look
camels,
at it.
that's
Look
fine.
at the
You can say
picture.
they're not camels. I encourage.
He's got a piece of a potsherd where there's part of an animal and someone drew in
Okay.
the hump.
No problem, that's
That
fine.
hump is not in there, is it?
Do we have an ostracon that refers to the Apiru engaged in construction work at the city of Pi-Ramses?
Apiru, we do, but there's scholarly debate about whether Apiru is a cognate of the word Hebrew. Some people say yes, some people say no. There were Israelites in the area. There were Israelites at the time. There might have been some small bands, but there's no evidence that there was 3 million Israelite slaves in Egypt at the time.
Do quail migrate through the Sinai Peninsula twice a year?
I don't know.
If they do, would that support the possibility of there being quail at the time there?
It would support the possibility, yeah.
Okay.
But 30 trillion stacked up
Does the Bible
to the
say
waist.
30 trillion?
The Bible says that the number of quail was up to 2 cubits high in a circle, a day's walk outside of the
Could the
camp.
quail have been circling around so they had to hit them instead of being...
It says they fell to the ground.
Yeah.
And they fell to the ground in a stack that was 2 cubits high, which
It
is
says a
about
stack
here.
2 cubits high.
Yes, they were in a pile, which
What's
was
the
in
verse
a
that says
pile
stack?
that it was in a pile that went all the way across a day's journey on both sides.
I'd like to see the verse that says stack.
Well, I don't have it right here in front of
Yeah,
me,
there is no- the
but
verse
they
says
were
stack.
they fell to the ground to a height of 2 cubits.
Do you believe in the JEDP theory for the Pentateuch?
I think that's a viable idea. The documentary hypothesis, I think, is very strong among many, because you can obviously see Yahweh by some writers, and you can see.
Are there any
Elohim.
manuscripts of J? Okay, have we found any manuscripts of J?
I don't think we have.
Have we found any manuscripts of E?
It depends how old is the manuscript. We have manuscripts.
Of
but yeah.
E? Really?
I don't know if we have.
No, we
any
have
actual-
none. Zippo. Do we have any manuscripts of D?
It's a hypothesis.
Do we have
right?
any manuscripts of P?
Well, no, we don't. But you are aware of the fact that the documentary hypothesis hypothesizes that those manuscripts are there because of the literary
So it's kind of a
criticism.
faith. Yeah, in other words, they hypothesize those manuscripts are there because if you assume miracles are impossible, you can't admit Moses wrote it. That's why they assume those manuscripts are there. There's no evidence at all for JEDP.
I think that, to answer your question, I think that's an unwarranted ad hominem accusation. Historians are not anti-supernaturalistic. And if you have to stoop to ad hominem to make your case and accuse people of having a bias, that shows a little bit of desperation. But no one claims that the documentary hypothesis has found those original documents. The documentary hypothesis assumes that, look at, here we have this writing style from this one, but this writing style only uses this word for God, and this one, and the priestly, the P documents only use this word. So it's a good hypothesis.
Are there any, how come nobody until the 19th century realized that there were really these sources in there that aren't there totally reasonable explanations of the text without assuming those sources are there?
It's called literary criticism, and you do it with all branches of literature. You do it with all branches of. You can see influences from one group to another. You can see influences from one type of people to another. You can see differences in languages. So I'm saying that the likelihood of the documentary hypothesis being true is very high. It's not 100%. There might be other things that come to knowledge, but it makes perfectly good literary critical sense to assume that there were different documents that were pieced together later into what we call the Pentateuch.
When those documents were supposed to have been written, the Suzerain Vassal Treaty format, which was what the Pentateuch was written in, had not existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. How did those different documentary sources figure out that the Pentateuch was in a Suzerain Vassal Treaty format?
I don't know.
Thank you.
The next part is going to be a simple 10-minute break. However, there can be questions asked of the debaters. Do we have at this time questions picked? All right. It is during the.
Okay. Okay, whatever. I'm just around my one of them.
Okay. Oh, kind. If you wish to leave for a bathroom break, etc., you may leave at this time. It will be just a simple 10-minute break in which questions will be asked. Thank you.
I don't want to hear too many lectures and talks, but did you notice, just for the record, we're doing a debate with opening statements and then rebuttals. Did you notice that Tom did not rebut my opening statement? Did you notice that? Did you notice that when I got up to rebut, I rebutted his opening statement? He claimed he was going to rebut my opening statement during his rebuttal, but did not. He just went on with more of the same. So as a debate point, he blew it on that one point. What he was really rebutting was his own rebuttal, basically, or he's rebutting my rebuttal. He admitted, by the way, that this 360-day year is what they used, and I've heard about that as well, but even if that's true, 360 is wrong. How many days are there in a year? 0.24 and whatever. Yeah, close enough. I did a debate in Bellevue, Washington on February 29th, 2000. And you know what's significant about that? I debated Phil Fernandez. That was one of the century years that you do have the leap year every 4 years rather than you don't to make the calendar work out. 360 is wrong. Using that number to count the days to Jesus is a mistake. It's wrong. It's bad history. It's special pleading. It's monkeying with numbers. The biblical writers were fond of monkeying with numbers, and they were fond of tampering with things. So Matthew especially, I think Matthew is the worst. Luke was better. I think Luke was a little bit better writer. Now notice that my original thesis did not say there's no history in the Bible. I did not say that. Remember when I talked about Stephen King? There was a Los Angeles. Wow, there was a Central Park in New York City, right? So you could prove that those places actually existed, right? Am I right? Does that mean Stephen King's book, The Stand, is historical? Who thinks it is? So you can see that this is a red herring. This is a non-argument he's using to say, look at, archaeologists have shown that that city did exist. No one's claiming that there's no history in the Old Testament. Obviously, there's some history in it, right? But it's historical fiction. There's a difference between historical fiction and fictionalized history. Historical fiction is some story that wasn't true, but then you dress it up with historical facts, like Stephen King's writings. It's not a true story, but you put it in a historical setting. The writers of the Old Testament did that. They had these untrue stories that were based on previous mythologies, and then they dressed them up in a historical setting. That's called historical fiction. That means the Old Testament is fictional. Fictional history is different. Fictional history is where you start with an actual historical person, but then you fictionalize their life. Like what was that silly movie about Abraham Lincoln and the zombies? Yeah, so that wasn't a true story, was it? But there was an Abraham Lincoln, right? So that's more like legend, and historical fiction is more like myth. The Old Testament is more like myth. That does not mean, and please don't misunderstand me, that does not mean there's no history or no truth in the Old Testament. There is some. There's history and truth in the writings of Stephen King. It's there, right? But on balance, the story is mainly fictional. It's not true. Those of you who believe it have been misled. You have been lied to. You've swallowed this lie, just like if it was the Greek mythology, just like if it was the Persian mythology. My Native American tribe, my dad's an American Indian, the Lenape tribe. We're called the Delaware Indians by the government. We're a really smart tribe of Indians. We're the tribe that sold Manhattan to the Dutch for $24. Boy, that's really smart. And we had 7 migrations, finally ending up in Oklahoma. But we have some stories about our foundational myths. In fact, Canal Street in Manhattan right now used to be a river. It was the Manetta River that was made into a canal, then made into a street. The Manetta River is where our hero, our ancient hero, Nanabush, conquered the snake Manetta and drove that snake underground into the Manetta River. And it was a great time in our history. That Manhattan Island is our promised land, our religion, our God. By the way, there were Native Americans. Our tribe was on this continent at least 12,000 years ago, if not 15,000 years ago, which, if you think about it, was 9,000 years before the world was created, if you're a young earth creationist. We had these stories long before the Israelites came on the scene. The Israelites are newcomers. There were all these myths and stuff happening before they came along, and it's very clear that they swapped, they borrowed, they interpolated, they rewrote things, just like the Broadway musical West Side Story. Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim admit that West Side Story was based on Romeo and Juliet. It's the same story, but they modernized it. They brought it up into the future. So if you look about it, instead of the Jets and the Sharks and the Capulets and the Montagues, you can see that they were rewriting an older template. The Israelites did the same thing. There's hardly anything in their stories that did not exist in mythical stories before that time. All of those stories were cut, not directly borrowed. West Side Story is not a copy of Romeo and Juliet, but you can see the template, you can see the pattern. And in the Old Testament, you can see the patterns, you can see the templates. If you look at the whole picture, Christians are always telling me I should look at it in context, then I'll understand it. Well, do that. Look at the context. Look at the time of history in which these stories were written down. They're not special. They're not unique. They're just as outrageous and just as crazy as any other mythologies. Tom asked whether 21st century historians would know more than the ancient writers knew. Well, yes, they often do. Often historians know more because the ancient writers had anachronisms, which I pointed to, which Tom did not rebut, by the way, tonight. And maybe he will get to some of that. But often modern historians can look back and see, they can see the mistakes that those ancient writers made when they were assuming things about their own history that were wrong because they were writing. In fact, much of the Bible is not even pretended to be history. It's supposed to be a tale of salvation and sin and obedience to this war god who's so jealous. By the way, did you know you know what name God called himself in the Bible? He said, my name is what? No. He said, my name is. When he said my name is in Exodus 34, what was his name? You should know this. If you believe in it, you should know what the name of God is. My name is jealous. That's what he said. Look it up in Exodus 34. I am the Lord your God whose name is jealous. The Lord jealous. He's a fiercely jealous, like a controlling husband over his wife, the Israelites, that he needs to love, and they need to love him. Otherwise, if they don't, he's going to kill them. He's going to massacre them. He's going to make them eat their children. If you look through the Bible, it's horrible. This is the kind of stuff of ancient mythology. And he commands filicide. He accepted the filicide of Jephthah's daughter and then rewarded Jephthah for his burning his own daughter as a sacrifice to God. He needs blood in order for sins to be atoned. Actual blood. He needs blood. He needs something to die. So this looks like ancient mythology. A God of the universe who can do anything he wants has to kill animals? When they were out in the Sinai Peninsula for those 40 years wandering out, imagine that, 3 million people. How many tents is that? How much land is that? How much grazing land would those cattle need? There was one story in there where they sacrificed 240,000 lambs, which means there were a lot more sheep and cattle than that. 240,000 lambs, and yet they needed manna from heaven. So what did they graze? Scholars have predicted that in order to have that, to support that kind of a group, you would have to have grazing land about the size of Rhode Island. It's just a crazy story. This 3 million people, picture how big that is, and they can't go 130 miles in 40 years. You and I could walk it in about a day and a half. It should be like walking over to the Minnesota border. If you walk nonstop pretty quick, you could do that. It took them 40 years because they were scared of the giants. Doesn't that sound like mythology? And by the way, did you notice a contradiction in what Tom said? It was against the law for people to write fake books, pseudographic books, but he admitted in his supposed rebuttal that there actually were pseudographical writings by the Jews back then. They actually did write fake books back then. And the Septuagint, of course, we know we shouldn't put too much stock in the Septuagint because it's a Greek translation of the one version of the Hebrew Scriptures. But the Septuagint made mistakes too, and one of the most glaring mistakes of the Septuagint was Isaiah 7:14, which, as Tom will tell you, Isaiah 7:14 says, "A young woman shall conceive," alma. When they knew the word virgin was betula, and they used that word, but Isaiah's wife was a young woman, and she conceived and had a son. But Matthew was reading not the Hebrew, he was reading the Greek. He was reading a mistaken translation, because the Greek says parthenos, which means virgin. So Matthew blew it. He was a sloppy scholar when he said, "Oh, look it, a virgin shall conceive." He didn't know that he was reading a corrupted translation from the earlier Hebrew. The Septuagint's not the Word of God, and yet the first century Christians read from the Septuagint, which was in many cases, a bad translation. We learn a lot from it, but we can see that the people who wrote those books were human beings, right? The people who wrote those books down. Human beings make mistakes. We all know that. I make mistakes. Tom makes mistakes. You make mistakes. So what made those ancient writers exempt? They were human beings. They made mistakes. They goofed. They misinterpreted. They borrowed. They sometimes lied in their writings. And even Paul admitted that in the Greek writings. So I guess the point I want to make is Tom didn't really rebut the issues that I raised, and I hope he does. And by the way, he set up a straw man. He said I said something that I didn't say. I did not doubt the historicity of Belshazzar, and yet in Tom's rebuttal, he said that I did doubt the history. And you heard me say earlier that Daniel is irrelevant. Suppose there is one book that actually is truly prophetic. Yeah, does that mean the whole thing? The whole Old Testament? Is that the kind of thinking you have? If you find one truth in there, oh, then the whole thing must be true? My argument is that on balance, even if there is some archaeologically valid sites and names in the Bible, and even if, contrary to my assumptions, there was a fulfilled prophecy, even if that were true, that does not mean that the Old Testament is a historically reliable book. That does not mean that it is not fictional. It is indeed fictional for all the reasons that I gave earlier, those 5 points, which I hope Tom will at least address maybe one of them.
Maybe Mr. Barker might not have read this. He's a very busy man, but we did send him over a month ago on the terms of conditions for the debate. It says in the statement of what we're doing that debate is over the fictional or factual character of the vast general body of the Old Testament. It is a debate over history, prophecy, archaeology, not over creation, evolution in Genesis 1:11, prehistory, geology, or biology. These would be worthwhile debates, but they are for another time. So I wasn't actually expecting to hear much about Genesis 1 through 11 because that was actually in the terms and conditions of the debate. That's a different debate for a different time. I think those are historically accurate documents as well, but I wasn't actually expecting to deal with that because the terms and conditions of the debate said that wasn't actually what we were going to be talking about. Mr. Barker spent a lot of time showing that he didn't like God. He says God is cruel, God is this, and God is that. And again, that's another debate. Actually, his view of morality is far inferior to what the Bible teaches, but that's a different debate. I'm convinced, I agree, Mr. Barker does not like God. I believe that with all my heart. Okay, it's great. That's not a debate. That's a different debate. He also says that basically some of the things he's saying about this being incredible is basically saying on his view of the world, miracles are impossible. And I agree. If I accept his assumption that miracles are impossible, then yes, we will conclude that the biblical miracles didn't happen. But that's just his presupposition of the impossibility of miracles. He said that he was going to give 5 things in this debate. Number 1 was there is no archaeological evidence for events in the Old Testament. I gave numbers of, I couldn't cover the whole Old Testament in 20 minutes, but I gave many examples of archaeological evidence for things in the Bible. I even showed him pictures of camels when he said there were no camels. We went through all kinds of things. The names of the 3 Hebrew children of Daniel are right there. They're on a document. And this is right there. There's a document. You can see their names there. I gave many examples. The walls of the Babylonian palace have plaster on them. How is he supposed to know that several centuries later? We've dug this palace up. The walls are exactly what Daniel said. There's lots of things like that I gave. I gave examples where he's quoting Daniel in the 6th century. Now, he says it's not specific. I would encourage the audience to read through Daniel chapter 11, read the pamphlet you have on the back there, see if those prophecies in Daniel 11, Daniel 9, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, see if they're these vague, whatever can mean anything thing, okay? Read them for yourself and see if that's the case. And remember that if this is a document that is written before the time of the Maccabean period, these are clear, unmistakable evidences that there's predictive prophecy validating God's claim that he can predict the future because he's the true God. And that would cover, if he's the true God, then we can conclude that everything in there is true. He said there's these mythical parallels. He didn't give any specifics. He didn't put up a quote of this whatever mythical parallel. That mythical thing is really, really non-historical. It's really bad. I would encourage you to watch Mr. Barker's debate with James White over whether the New Testament, Jesus is a legend. And he says there's these mythical parallels. He thinks that in the Gospel of Mark, it's copying Homer and just all these. It's really, really terrible argument. So we need some specific myths here. Also, a parallel doesn't prove that it's made up anyway. We need something better than this. This is not good history to just cite vague myths of whatever and then nothing specific here. Okay. Historical anachronisms. We didn't get any historical anachronisms, or maybe if I can't think of any. Maybe I'm not infallible. Maybe he gave one that I can't think of. Okay. Historical evidence of. I'm going to give you some more things. He was talking about the Exodus. We mentioned that there's references to Habiru engaging in construction work at the city. We know in the New Kingdom period, which is the period when Israel would have been there were actually many slaves, Canaanite slaves. In fact, the word for Canaanite and slave kind of became synonymous in Egyptian because they had so many slaves then. They didn't have Canaanite slaves in many earlier periods. They didn't have many Canaanite slaves in the later periods when supposedly on these mythical JEDP documents, the Old Testament was made up. They didn't have Canaanite slaves really back then. That's kind of interesting situation. His view of the Pentateuch is that it's made up of these 4 documents, which we have no copies of, no evidence, no references to them anywhere in any document that exists. But I'm the one that has an unjustified faith. When he is believing that Moses didn't write it, even though it looks like a treaty format that existed at the time. But no. 1,000 years later, when they didn't even know about this treaty format, somehow JE and DP, who we have no evidence for, kind of came together and here we go, and that's how it came about. That's not good history. We know that there's references to the different places that you can actually, if you get a good book on Old Testament history, like K.A. Kitchen's on the reliability of the Old Testament, or Joseph Free's Archaeology and Bible History, you can actually find the places where they went in the Exodus. You can locate these places. They're actual cities that are there. They're actual places that are there. He said that it took them 40 years to go across. They weren't trying to they weren't like walking like really slow or something. They were stopping in places. Okay, this is not a good argument against the Bible being historical to say that it took them so long. This must be a myth. They were staying in different places. That's just a very bad argument. Kitchen, who is a very, very scholarly man, he was the professor of Egyptology at the School of Archaeology, Classics, Oriental Studies, University of Liverpool. His conclusion was the Exodus is both a viable and realistic proposition. The narratives show a practical knowledge of Sinai conditions, not readily to be gained by late Romance writers in exilic Babylon or an impoverished Persian Hellenic Judea, hundreds of miles from the places of phenomenon in question. So that's pretty clear. He just brought up Isaiah 7:14. The word Alma was a young woman of marriageable age who was a virgin. Israel, if you're a young woman of marriageable age, unlike today, you were a virgin, okay? If you weren't a virgin, bad things would happen to you when you got married. So it was a young woman, yes, but just any young woman. No, she was a young one who was a virgin. He says it should be Bethulah. If Matthew didn't know what he's doing, it should be Bethulah. Joel 1:8 says, lament like a virgin, Bethulah, girded with sackcloth for the husband of her youth. So if it had said Bethulah, he would have said, oh, Joel 1:8, not a virgin, not a virgin. So sorry, actually Alma is a great word to use. And he's saying it's just some young woman giving birth. Okay, let's think about the context of Isaiah 7:14 here. Let's think about this for a second. Isaiah 7:14, Isaiah is trying to give a sign to the king that he can trust God and not give in to this country that had way more military, way more what stuff. Okay, Isaiah says to the king, ask a sign of the Lord your God in heaven above or earth beneath so that you can trust in God. So he's asked for this huge sign. And he says, oh, no, I won't ask for a sign. And so then Isaiah gives a sign that a virgin shall conceive. That's a miracle. A virgin conceiving would be a real sign. A young woman giving birth, okay, listen. King, you can trust God because a woman's going to give birth who's married and just like normal. So, obviously, is that a sign? That's a miracle? No. Alma it's Isaiah 7:14 is accurate. It's a virgin shall conceive. That is actually what it is saying. He said that there are 360-day years, but somehow the year is 362.5. So he didn't deny that those countries had years that were 360 days long. And he didn't deny that it worked out to the right day for Christ. Okay? Is that chance? Chance somehow decree, Nehemiah, 360-day year, which is what they had. Oh, wow, somehow it's the right year. Somehow the people who lived back then, the Essenes, the Pharisees, these people who were thinking about Daniel 9, somehow they thought Messiah was coming first century. It's chance, not specific, it's not specific. It is specific. There's other historical things in all kinds of historical stuff that doesn't make sense in later conditions. For example, you're not going to find some scroll or something that says Abraham. Abraham was a nomad, okay? He wasn't some major, big person. But can you see that this fits the time period that it was written? Or does it fit some way later time period? It fits the time period when it was written very, very well. So, for example, when Rachel stole the gods of Laban, and then Laban sent all his guys who was chasing them, and why were they so mad at these gods? Just a bunch of silver, maybe they could buy them on eBay or something, get them back. Well, why were those gods valuable? Because those were the family inheritance. If you had the gods, you actually could take all the inheritance of somebody. That's an example of a custom that was extant at the time that Abraham was supposed to exist, and Jacob and those guys, okay? So we see there's many other things like that where we actually see it fits. Sodom and Gomorrah, we actually know where the cities were. We see that there was actually a time when they were destroyed by fire. That's archaeologically valid. The old Genesis talks about the kings, the 4 kings, the 5 kings. We actually can see the routes that they went. They fit. It fits the time. It fits the time exactly. The tablets that I mentioned, the Nuzi tablets, actually show that possession of the father's household gods plays an important role in the inheritance. During that time, we said there were slaves in Egypt. Canaanite became a synonym for slaves. Okay. We also see that I mentioned already that there's all kinds of other things like that. You can just go through, get a good book on archaeology, look it up. Daniel chapter 11, which he just said it's very vague. Some of these things are not. Oh, the screen isn't even on. Huh, okay, that's nice. Can we turn that on? There we go. Okay, good. Some of the things in Daniel chapter 11 are not very vague. It says specific things about the kings. It says like who's going to give his wife to the other one. It says about what they're going to do in terms of having these covenants and treaties and so on. It's not vague at all. It's very, very specific. These predictions are not just some sort of weird generalization thing there. And if he says, oh, maybe there was prophecy, maybe it actually is there, well, then it has to be God that did it, because there's no way that the 150 plus things that are specifically mentioned in the book of Daniel chapter 11 and in the other chapters of Daniel, there's no way that could have been just made up by, somehow by chance it just happened. That is not a reasonable explanation of things at all. We have the grammar of the Old Testament, the vowels and the consonants fit comparative Semitic grammar of the other countries that are around there. It fits when it was claimed to have been written, not some way later thing. So this actually fits stuff, okay? It fits the context of when it claims to have been written perfectly. And it doesn't fit later context. Moses in Egypt, when Moses went to Egypt, or Joseph rather, when Joseph went to Egypt, it says that he was in a popular high place, and then there was a time when a Pharaoh came that didn't know Joseph. What was that? How could the Pharaoh not know about Joseph? Well, at that time, there was a group of people called the Hyksos, and they came in, and they were a minority government that ruled over Egypt for a while, okay? So that fits here. Joseph was with the reigning line of kings, and then all of a sudden, this other group of people comes in who are a different group, and they take over, and that's why they don't know who Joseph is. And that minority group, that's why in Exodus it says the Israelites are more numerous than we Egyptians. Well, were the Israelites more numerous than the whole country of Egypt? No, they weren't. But they were more numerous than the minority government that was ruling over the land. So that was a pretty good thing. Somehow later they just knew all these details of these specific things. They fit the history very well. How did they do that? How did they do that? Okay, we have references to, like when the pharaohs came in the 1200s, we have references to them coming in and taking over in the land. There's references to Israelites being there at that time. So that fits. Again, all these things fit very well. We have references to, we see times where they're making straw without bricks, like in the Bible. There's references to that. So all these things fit very, very well. Can you go to the end that I was going to show the slide? Mr. Barker said that he does not have an anti-supernatural bias. I would encourage you to consider whether that really is the case or not. This is what Mr. Barker said. I think it's like one of the last slides. This is what Mr. Barker said in the debate he had with Dr. Bass from Dallas Seminary. He said, even if Jesus did exist, even if I agreed with his opponent, Dr. Bass, 100%, yep, he rose from the dead, yep, there's a God, yep, I don't deny any of that, does not mean that he's my Lord. If he did exist, I will go happily to hell. It would be worse of a hell for me to bow down before a Lord, regardless of the legend and historicity issue. Even if I agreed 100%, I would still reject that being as the Lord of my life, because I'm better than that. I cannot accept Jesus as Lord. You're much more free to live and enjoy your life unshackled from the demands to have some Lord of your life. To me, I think that's more important than all this historicity stuff, which you heard me admit is a matter of probabilities. I might be wrong. That still doesn't mean that Jesus is Lord. He is not the Lord of my life. I'll let you decide if that's bias or not, okay? Don't have that attitude. Be honest with the text of Scripture. It is not made up later. It's true. It has predictive prophecies that are very specific. All the books fit the times that they were written. Don't have the attitude that I am not willing to listen to this evidence because I do not want Jesus to be my Lord. Now, you know what? If that's your attitude, don't even investigate it, because you know what? You'd be better off not knowing the facts. Just go your way, believe your lie, don't get any more evidence for it, because it'll just make your eternal damnation worse, okay? But if that's your attitude, then don't just ignore the facts. Put it all of your mind, believe, oh, it's all made up, no camels, no facts that fit these things, not there, believe that, go ahead. But if that's not your attitude, if you are willing to have Jesus as your Lord, if the Bible is true, then look into this. Look into the facts, people. See if this is actually an accurate historical document, in fact, the very revelation of God. And by the way, in terms of the purpose of the debate, Mr. Barker did not even come close to proving that over 50% of the Bible is legend. He made these vague references to things. He didn't even come close to that. Legend, he did not prove that by any means. So I would encourage you to, in this short period of time, can we cover every single thing? We can't cover every single thing. I probably forgot some things that he said. I wasn't trying to. I want to deal with them, but I'm not infallible like the Bible is. So I don't remember everything he said. But there's plenty of evidence for the Bible. There's specific prophecies. We went over lots of them. There's all kinds of evidence. It's true. Thank you.
So this is our final closing, then we do questions?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good. So we heard another straw man from Tom tonight. I never did say that I have an anti-supernaturalistic bias against miracles. In fact, I have repeatedly said that miracles might happen. What my claim is that they are extremely unlikely. Unlikely. You probably think it's possible that cat spoke to me, don't you? It's possible, but you think it's very unlikely, right? So that's not saying you have an anti-cat speaking bias. It's just saying that you think based on previous knowledge and what we know about the world, you're going to give that an extremely low probability. In fact, in science, scientists will admit, well, we have a 98%, 99%. Let's round it off for now. We're going to go with it as a fact, admitting that they might be wrong. I happily admit I might be wrong. But Tom is right. If the God of the Bible does exist, and if that Jesus actually did exist as presented in the Bible, if it were presented to me as a fact, right? There's Jesus. I have a moral obligation to denounce that monster. I am better than that. I don't send people to eternal torment because they disagree with me. I don't call people fools simply because they've used their brains to come to another conclusion. I don't threaten with violence. I don't threaten genocide of entire nations. I don't put down women and call my lover a whore and a prostitute if she looks at another man. That's what the God of the Bible did all over the place. I don't threaten with pestilence and curses. The covenant of God in the New Testament, really that covenant, you shall love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, was said just before they were going to go in and commit genocide against these people. They're going to harvest crops that they didn't plant and live in cities that they didn't build. They were killing man, women, and children because they worshiped the wrong God. You are better than that. And I am better than that brutal, bloodthirsty monster that's in that book. If he did exist, I would happily go to hell. Happily, proudly, with some integrity, rather than pretend to worship such a monster that we see in the pages of the Bible. Think about it. Use reason. Use morality. Wouldn't you praise somebody who stood up to Hitler and said, nope, put me in the gas chamber, fine. I would rather resist you than go along with your murderous plan for the human race. It's not a bias. I don't say that because I have a bias. I say that because I drew a moral conclusion. I look at the evidence. I look at, he didn't exist, and it's all a fiction. But if he did, then I would denounce him morally. He's cruel. He's not worthy of my respect as a human being. If he wants to prove what a big macho man he is and send me to hell anyway, let him do it. If he's that powerful and that cruel, let him do it. Fine. Does that make it right? Does might make right? Do threats make something morally right? Does stealing and genocide and ethnic cleansing and pestilence and curse hurling and slave mongering, does that make it right because the big powerful God said it? But of course, it's all a myth. It's a good thing it's a myth, isn't it? It's a good thing it's a fiction. I think good Christians and good Jews would prefer that it not be true. Because if it were true, what a horrible world we would live in. So how do you know what is true? How do we actually know what is truth? Jesus said, I am the truth, but truth is not a thing or a person. A person can't be the truth. That's just rhetoric. Truth is the degree with which a statement corresponds with reality. And when you look at the Old Testament, you see that most of it does not correspond with reality. Some of it does. And I repeatedly said, and I think Tom is mischaracterizing what I've been saying tonight, there is some truth in the Old Testament. There is some history in the Old Testament. Big deal. You can find an inscription. Wow, that city did exist. Big deal. But don't you see my comparison with Stephen King? Yeah, but big deal. Are the stories true? Yeah, you might find a certain mountain. You might find a certain piece of pottery. Yeah, great. I agree with you. But are the stories true? Is it a fable or is it a fact? It's not true because your parents say it. It's not true because your church says it. It's not true because your teachers or your preachers or some holy book that you happen to be born into. You happen to be born into this culture. If you were born in Baghdad, it would be the Quran that you'd be worshiping. It's not true because some leaders, dictators, religious masters tell you that it's true. Something is true by observation, not by what you wish, not by what makes you feel good. Truth comes through observation and through reality. By the way, Isaiah 7:14, you're wrong about that. And I'll explain why. If you look at the next verse, look at chapter 8 of the book of Isaiah, we see the fulfillment of that prophecy. It says, behold, a young woman shall conceive. That young woman was the prophet's wife. She did conceive in chapter 8. She did give birth to a son. His name was not Emmanuel. He was supposed to overthrow the Assyrians. That failed. That prophecy, there was a local prophecy made back then in Isaiah 7:14, failed. The Alma was the young wife of the prophet.
I'd like to thank the audience for coming today. Thank you for taking the time to investigate this important topic. I'm thankful for everyone who came out. I'm thankful for Mr. Barker being willing to debate the subject, and for all of you for being able to consider this. I'm not going to introduce, in the concluding statement, you're really not supposed to introduce new information, so I'm not really going to be doing that with Mr. Barker's statement because he was introducing lots of new information. You're not supposed to do that in the concluding statement. But I'd like to just remind you of some things that were already said in this debate. He said, facts, we have plenty and plenty of facts. Can I cover every single fact in 20 minutes? No. Here are some facts that this particular book of the Bible, which I was focusing on, which he didn't refute any of these facts, is a 6th century composition written by Daniel. And if it is, there's clear predictive prophecies, and it's historically accurate too, which is what we're talking about here. So Daniel claims to have written his book. If you go through the slides here, he claims to have written it. Next slide. We know that pseudonymity was not acceptable in the canonical books. Now, we're not saying that nobody ever just wrote a story, okay? But in the canon, it wasn't accepted in the canon. That was not an acceptable thing. We see that all the Jews thought that it was written by him all the way back. There's no evidence of anybody else. No Jew saying that it wasn't written by him. No Christian said that it wasn't written by him. We see also that it's quoted by Ezekiel, his contemporary. It specifically says Daniel, referring to his wisdom, referring to his righteousness. As a contemporary, it mentions him in the 6th century. So obviously the book, it exists, okay? It wasn't made up later. We had other references. You can go back to the other slide. It was referenced in Tobit, which is before the time that the prophecies of Antiochus Epiphanes lived. It's referenced in the book of Watchers. It's referenced in Maccabees. This guy in the book of Maccabees speaks about the book of Daniel, Matthias. But Matthias died before the time that the anti-supernaturalist date says the book was written. Okay? So these are facts. Facts that show this is a true predictive prophecy, truly historically accurate when it claims to be a 6th century document. Next slide, please. We see that the Septuagint, all the evidence that we have shows that it was written before the time that the anti-supernaturalist date was saying. We have references to Daniel's 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, on actual documents dating back to the time in the 6th century. How did the 2nd century guy know that? We have references to Nebuchadnezzar being the builder of Babylon, which we discovered now, not referenced. There's no way a 2nd century guy would know that things. These are all facts, okay? We know that there are references to the Babylonian walls being plastered, references to the numbering system they had, references to the Babylonian and Persian customs. These are facts, not just made up whatever. And we figured out that Mr. Barker does not like God. And I agree. If that was the debate, whether Mr. Barker likes God or not, I will concede the debate to him. That wasn't the debate tonight. It wasn't about morality. I think he would lose the debate on morality. That wasn't the debate. The debate is whether the Bible is mainly legend or fact. And I've given fact after fact after fact after fact, and he has not dealt with them. We have the cylinder there, the Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah referenced right there on a cylinder. Some of the things he tried to bring up were simply false. There's no evidence. He said there's no extreme statements. And even very few people, no archaeological evidence at all for any of these things. They gave all kinds of examples. We know the slaves were there. We know that the Pentateuch is written in this treaty format that fits the time that it says it was written. Lots of facts. No camels. I showed pictures of camels. Okay. Go to the next one here. The late date is simply anti-supernatural bias. That is the fact. He can say that he's not biased. You can decide for yourself on that quote that he said whether that's biased or not, okay? The book of Daniel is written in 6th century Hebrew, 6th century Aramaic. It does not fit the 2nd century. It's not written, if it was in the 2nd century, it would have Greek stuff in it. We have documents that are earlier than the 2nd century. This is an early document. And if it's early, you read it through. Read Daniel 11. Read Daniel 2 and 7. Read the pamphlet we have back there and see if these are genuine predictive prophecies. He did not deny that from the decree of Nehemiah in 444 BC to the Messiah, he did not deny that it worked out. He just said, oh, they can't have a 360-day year, even though that's what they had. No, they should have used something else. So is the chance that it works out? This isn't some random number. It's not like 26.894 and you make that work out. No, this is the year they had. This is a reasonable interpretation. He did not give any alternative explanation for it. The city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in Daniel chapter 9. He didn't explain. How is that the case? We have copies of Daniel that date to before the Roman times. We have copies of Daniel that date to before the prophecies of Daniel 9 were fulfilled, copies that are older than the time the Romans took power. How did Daniel know about the Romans? How did Daniel know these specific dates? It's because it's historically accurate. Even its predictions are historically accurate. This shows that the Bible is fact, not fiction. Thank you.
All right, the next part is going to be the question portion. Each question will be directed towards one of the debaters, and they will be given a maximum of 1 minute to answer the question, and if they so choose, the other person may respond, and they would have 30 seconds at most. I'm going to try to get through these as quickly as possible as we are running out of time. Thank you. The first question will be for Dan Barker. The question reads, since holidays are established to commemorate historical events like Independence Day, what could be the origin of the Jewish Passover if you deny that the historical event, if you deny the historical event of the Exodus?
The Jews, when they celebrate Seder today, and most of my Jewish friends and the rabbis that I know do not think it was a historical event. They think it was a mythological. They say it was an allegorical story. They do not think it was historical. There are some Orthodox Jews who do. But you can celebrate an event that wasn't based in history. That's no big surprise. You can celebrate something that didn't happen, although it was meaningful in your foundational myth of your country. So, and by the way, I wouldn't use the word celebrate, because the Passover is celebrating the death of innocent children who happen to belong to the wrong religion. Bloodshed. Every time I see one of those little matzo crackers, I think dead babies. That's what they're celebrating. The God of the universe killing innocent babies to convince Pharaoh to change his mind. So if they want to celebrate that, fine. But you can celebrate, you know, like Switzerland. Did William Tell actually exist? Probably not. But they still celebrate the foundation of their country by having a celebration over that myth.
The next question.
I'll respond. One, I think it's a good question that the Passover existing would actually support the existence of an actual event. I think it's ironic, as Mr. Barker keeps talking about morality instead of the topic at hand, historicity, that he's in favor of the legality of taking little babies in the womb and murdering them, yet he complains about other types of murder. I think that's an interesting thing. One actual other interesting thing with Passover is actually Passover, this is not an Exodus, but actually we have a reference in an Elephantine document, a command from the Persian king Darius II, the Jews should celebrate the Passover feast of unleavened bread. Oh.
Sorry. Well, the next question will be asked for Mr. Ross here, and it is by an individual named Ed. Archaeology and evidence have shown particular events to be excluded from occurring. Specifically, Jericho was abandoned at the time of the supposed conquering of Canaan and had been for a while. How do you respond to such a statement? Yeah.
First, I would say that actually there is some dispute about when Jericho was destroyed. Garstang actually thought that he found the layer, the archaeologist, when Jericho was destroyed, the demolition layer. That was possible. Some other archaeologists think that actually that whole period of time washed away. Now, if the whole period of time eroded and washed away, then you would not expect to find anything. So for another situation like that, actually where the Israelites were living in Egypt was the Delta region, there's actually no documents practically of any kind of that time. And so slaves living in mud hovels aren't going to write a lot of stuff. So there are certain times where you wouldn't expect, and it'd be unreasonable to expect lots and lots of evidence. So if Garstang is right, we found where Jericho was. If the other guys are right, then it might have all just washed away, and we have no evidence of anything at the time. But that doesn't mean they weren't there.
He seems to be agreeing that there is a lack of evidence then. By the way, I have to say, and this might be irrelevant, but you bordered on slander there by saying that I am a person who supports murder. I do not. And that was below the belt, that was ad hominem, that was unfair. I do not support murder. The God of the Bible does, but I don't.
Thank you. The next question is asked for Mr. Barker. Can you give proof for the historical errors in the Old Testament? For example, can you give proof for there being no domesticated camels in the times of the pharaohs?
Oh. Yeah, well, I will point you to, and I don't have the, well, maybe I can look it up here.
Sorry, my apologies. Sorry. Patriarchs.
Times of the Patriarchs.
Yes.
Yeah, well, Tel Aviv magazine by Israeli scholars who have examined that whole area archaeologically, and I forget the woman's name who was the author of it. You can find it online. Look online, domesticated camels in the time in Israel. My argument was not that there were no camels, and yet Tom seemed to be thinking that was my argument. There were camels. There were camels in the Americas, there were precursors to them. The argument was where they were domesticated camel herds and caravans. There were none, and that article in Tel Aviv magazine points to the archaeological evidence that the introduction of domestic camels to the Middle East, not to the rest of the world, but to the Middle East, was around the year 930 BCE. Before that time, there were no camel herds or populations or camel caravans, in spite of some of these broken fragments that Tom thinks show that they're carrying something on their back.
I'll respond. I think I did show him actual pictures of camels carrying stuff. There's other evidence for camels as well. Genesis does not even say there are these huge herds of camels being raised. There's just a few camels. So if he concedes there are possibilities of a few camels, then there's no historical problem here. He somehow needs to prove that there were no camels and nobody was riding them when they were riding them. Somehow, I don't think you can do that. And the camel argument is not a good one. He's actually arguing some kind of, I think he's a little bit out of date in certain things. Like, there's lots of things that people used to claim there are problems with the Bible that the more we find, they're legitimate.
Right. Mr. Ross, will you agree with the would you agree with the point that one reason for increasing skepticism today is the freedom of information and right to voice skepticism?
I do not think that's a reason why. I think one big reason why skepticism is increasing is because actually in our educational system, you get it pounded into you for years and years and years. For example, when I was growing up, I had evolution pounded into me so hard that I thought if you disagreed with it, you were just some kind of brainless fool. And I hadn't read anything on either side. So I actually think that atheistic bias in our state school system is a very, very good reason for an increasing amount of skepticism. And actually, I think another reason is a lot of corrupt false Christianity. Just because somebody says that he's a Christian does not mean he's a Christian. If you think that salvation is by works, if you think that you're going to heaven because you can speak in tongues, or you ask Jesus into your heart, that doesn't mean you're saved. The Bible says repent and believe the gospel. And there's a lot of corrupt Christianity, and that stuff can't change your life, can't do anything good for you. And so when that turns you off, then you can become, a skeptic or an atheist. And that's very reasonable. You may do less damage that way, actually, than keeping your false Christianity.
I think all of us are skeptics. Every Christian in this room is a skeptic when it comes to someone else's religion. You're skeptical of the Persian religion. You're skeptical of the Muslim religion. You're skeptical of my Native American ancestors' claims of the origin of the earth on the back of a turtle. You are correctly skeptical of those claims. Skepticism is no big new thing. So I think it's probably true that now that the internet has more information out there, it's easier to check up and see why we have good reason to be skeptical of these outrageous claims.
Mr. Barker, how do you explain the finding of chariot wheels and military gear at the bottom of the Red Sea in the place where the Bible claims the Israelites left Egypt?
There was a man who said that he found a chariot wheel under the Red Sea. There is no chariots and there are no wheels. He said there's an 8-spoked wheel, chariot wheel, that he found in the bottom of the Red Sea. Archaeologists have not made that claim. Historians have not made that claim. That was made by an American evangelical preacher who said he saw this wheel with 8 spokes on it, but he misplaced it. Nobody can find it. So, sure, you're going to find some artifacts through history, but if you find an artifact that maybe kind of looks like something that happened in the Bible, does that prove that the Bible actually happened? That's really, really grasping at straws. And in this case, it's a non-existent straw.
I believe you can actually find pictures of the wheel, so it's not non-existent.
This is to Mr. Ross. Why is it permissible for God to have a shifting morality? Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 10. When to stone your family.
Don't start the question until I take a look at it. 6 through 10, right?
What was the verse, Deuteronomy?
13, 6 through 10.
I don't believe that God actually does have a shifting morality. Actually, I think that apart from revelation from God, we actually can't have any justifiable morality of any kind. So if we're all just cosmic broccoli, then we actually don't have any significance of any kind. I believe that the laws in the Bible are just, and actually in a theocratic system, God was actually, with the Canaanites, so in this passage, I think it was a right law in Deuteronomy 13. And also, if you're going to have, when they came into the land of Canaan, if you can dry up the Red Sea, and you can make plagues come, and you can make manna come, and you can make the day last longer, if that's the only time you have any kind of aggressive war, how many aggressive wars are we going to have? I don't think we're going to have very many. So there's actually, I think the biblical morality is totally justifiable. And if you're going to attack biblical morality, first we need to establish what our objective basis is to attack it. Otherwise, we're borrowing from the Bible. We're borrowing from biblical morality to attack it.
It doesn't matter what you believe, Tom. You can have your beliefs. We all have our beliefs. You can believe what you want about your God. Christians today think slavery is wrong. I don't think any Christians today believe in slavery. But the Old Testament is a slave manual. Right after the Ten Commandments, the God of the Bible tells them what to do, how to buy slaves. You pay more for a male slave than a female. And if they have children, well, the children have to stay with the master. The master can do what he wants sexually with the female slave. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there about nothing anti-slavery in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. So there is indeed a shifting morality in the Bible.
I'd like somebody to ask me a question about slavery in the Bible.
For the sake of time, I am only going to ask 4 more questions, 2 for each speaker. This question goes for Mr. Barker. There is evidence of giants. Skeletons were even found in Wisconsin. So are giants really mythical?
Well, if by giant you mean a big person, yeah. There's always going to be somebody at the tail end of the bell curve. You're going to find some individuals in every population that you would call. There's probably some in this room, right? Andrew. Stand up, Andrew. Is he a giant or what? No? Well, he's a pretty big guy. But there's no evidence of giants. There's no evidence of the Nephilim, who were supposedly the offspring of the sons of God with the daughters of men because they saw they were fair. Actually, intercourse between angels and human females. There's no evidence of any of those giants. And there should be thousands of skeletons in graveyards of the supposed race of giants that the Israelites were afraid of. There's not.
You have plenty of examples of large people today. Arguing that some people in the Bible were large is not a very good argument. I think it's an argument that evidences anti-supernaturalist bias. It talks about large people, they're giant, they want to fight. I'd rather be big if I was going to fight. That's not a very good argument. I also think the sons of God, daughters of men passage is actually about the sons of God were actually the godly line, and the daughters of men were the ungodly line, so actually that isn't anything there anyway. He's trying to get mileage out of something that is not there to get mileage out of.
The next question is for Mr. Ross. Do you believe your wife, sister, or mother, when she was younger, should sit on a pillow throughout her menstruation because she is/was unclean?
There are ceremonial laws and civil laws and moral laws in the Old Testament, and those are not just arbitrary classifications, they are justifiable. Some of the ceremonial laws of Israel were actually to set them apart as a people. They did have a good purpose. They distinguished them from the other nations. So I think that law did help classify them as separate from the other people. And so that's what it was. I don't think that, so no, does my wife do that? No, she doesn't go on a pillow, if you're wondering.
So I would say that that's some evidence that a lot of the Old Testament is irrelevant to today. We're better than that. If you want to consider those ceremonial laws, you could say the same thing about the laws against homosexuality in the Bible, which were considered during the Holiness Code, ceremonial laws, that was for that time, but not for today. It's wonderful that we now have gay marriage, which is an improvement over the old ceremonial laws of the Old Testament.
Next question is asked by Luke Rains and is for Mr. Barker. If reason is the basis of truth, how can man know the truth if man is not all-knowing?
Well, that question assumes that the truth is a thing. Truth is not a thing. You put a capital T on it, doesn't mean, oh, there's truth somewhere. Truth is just a label for the degree with which a statement corresponds with reality. So the way to know is to look at that statement and see if it corresponds to some degree or another. If it corresponds high enough, we say, yep, that's true. If it doesn't, we say no. The only way to do that is through observation. There were a lot of Christians who used to believe that men had one fewer rib than women because the Bible says that. They believed it. I knew people that. Observation shows us that that's just not true.
But the Bible never says all men have one fewer rib than women. That is simply not in there. I would suggest that he tries to do a better job
I
finding
never said
contradictions
that.
in the Bible.
I never said the Bible said that.
Okay, well, it sounded kind of like it, I thought. Okay, maybe you didn't say that. Okay, fine.
I said Christians
I would
believe
suggest
it.
that, yeah, Christians believe all kinds of things that are weird.
Yeah.
So do atheists. But that doesn't prove that it's false. I would suggest that logic, the scientific method, even making objective claims, like when Mr. Barker said truth is not a thing, he's making an objective claim of truth. He's claiming it's true that truth is not a thing. He's actually borrowing from the biblical system of thought to attack it.
And last question is from JD, and this is for Mr. Ross. Prophecies in one book do not establish the legitimacy of the Bible. What evidence from other books do you believe establishes the biblical legitimacy?
One thing I would say that the books are there is a kind of unity to them. If one actually gives evidence that the Jehovah God of the Bible exists, and there's clear evidence for that, that would be a good reason to include the rest of them are true. That isn't the only book with that kind of evidence. There's actually thousands. There's over 1,800 predictions in the Bible that are very specific. There's hundreds of messianic prophecies. The Bible is also confirmed by archaeology. And most of all, the risen Lord and Savior, the creator of the universe, Jesus Christ, actually said the Bible is true, and that's a great reason to believe it. And also, I know the author, and since I've come to know him, I know for sure that it's true.
I used to believe that I knew the author, but now I know I was deluding myself. Those who claim to know Jesus don't. You have an idea in your mind, but you actually don't have. And if you're going to use personal experience to validate the historicity of an ancient collection of books, that's really stretching. I mean, that's really sophomoric. You should look at it on its own merits and not inject your own personal bias and presupposition against the natural. It was what you seem to have, accusing me of the opposite presupposition. So let's go where the evidence leads. Let's use reason. Let's use kindness. And let's follow the facts wherever they might lead. In my case, they lead away from the factual Old Testament.
All right. Real quick here, how about a round of applause for our two debaters?
Thank you, Mr. Barker.
Good guy. You're very articulate.
I'd like to thank those who helped me make the slides, too. I am not good at making slides. That was so helpful. Thank you very much, my slide makers.
Do either of you two have anything else you wish to sort of plug here before we start closing up?
So my current book is called Life-Driven Purpose, which turns Rick Warren upside down. The purpose-driven life is the wrong way to look at the world. You can find that online. But my new book, God, the most unpleasant character in all fiction. I can't wait till that comes out. We want to get it in every hotel room in the country.
I would encourage those that have come to this debate to check out my website, faithsaves.net. I'd also encourage you to get a copy of that book in the back on the historicity of Daniel and the prophecies. That's also on the website. Updating a little bit, there's a lot of other resources, scholarly resources giving evidence for the Bible is true. And I would encourage you also to consider the Bible actually is there's lots of evidence for it, but it's also self-attesting. If you're honest with it and you read it carefully, read the Gospel of John, you'll see that it actually is true. It's actually God's own word. Thank you very much for coming.
All right. As president of the Philosophy Club, I'm going to plug my organization as well, very shamelessly. We meet every Thursday in room 2314 here in Highland from 6:15 to 7:15 and to debate various topics that are democratically chosen. I know it's been a long night, and I thank all of you for coming out to see this, and I wish you all a pleasant evening.